Hello everyone, I'm Taha. I'm a fourth year medical student, and in this video we are going to go over the clinical presentation of appendicitis. So in the previous video we've had a look at the pathophysiology of appendicitis, and in today's video we're going to have a look at the list of the clinical presentations, or the signs and the symptoms of appendicitis. And we'll dive into why those signs and symptoms are actually occurring. Okay, so let's just jump straight into the video. Like always, we are going to bring back our beloved patient, Mr. Whitecoat. Okay. Now, Mr. Whitecoat has appendicitis, so let's have a look at what sort of signs and symptoms he will actually present with. Now, the main one that we need to understand here is that the most typical sign or I should say symptom of appendicitis is abdominal pain. Okay. So, abdo pain. Now, it's a very specific type of abdominal pain. So, the abdominal pain in appendicitis typically starts as a very generalized pain, okay? And as the condition sort of progresses, it becomes a very localized pain. And you'll be wondering, where is this pain actually being localized to? It localizes into the right lower quadrant, so the right iliac fossa. Okay, now let's just visualize this quickly. Okay, so let's imagine we have the abdomen here, and we've got the nine quadrants. So this is the umbilicus. Now, in the beginning, so at the beginning of appendicitis, the pain will start as a very general pain around the umbilicus, right? It is very dull in nature, so it's not localized, it's not pinpoint at all, and over time, what happens is that this pain then shifts. Okay, it eventually becomes a right lower quadrant pain. Okay, now more specifically, if we have a look at that sort of pathway, so this right here is the umbilicus, right, and this right here is the right lower quadrant, or for this example we're going to make this the ACEs. Okay, now the pain shifts from the umbilicus, or a very generalized pain, into the right lower quadrant at some point we call McBurney's point. Okay, this right here is McBurney's point. McBurney's point is the space between the umbilicus and the anterior superior iliac spine, right? And 1/3 of the way from the ACEs to the umbilicus is McBurney's point, right? That is McBurney's point. So at this point is where the pain then becomes very localized to, and that is roughly where the appendix actually lies within an average human being, right? So like we mentioned, it starts as a very generalized pain and then becomes a localized pain at McBurney's point. So let's have a look at why the pain actually starts as general and why then does it become a localized pain. So it's very interesting actually, because the reason for it is because of the embryological origin. So the appendix initially was a midline organ, okay, and obviously in embryonic development throughout that period of time, as the organs within the abdomen settle into their correct position, so obviously the appendix being in the right lower quadrant, the visceral afferents, so the nerve fibers that innervated the appendix at the point at which it was in the midline, remain. Okay, so you can trace those back to their origins. So that's why when we have inflammation and pain of the appendix, the brain assumes that it is still at the midline. So that's why we have umbilical generalized pain, and the reason being, the reason for the generalized pain is because they are innervated by visceral afferents, right? Now, visceral afferents are part of the autonomic nervous system, and visceral afferents innervate the organs of the abdomen, okay? Now, they are not as dense as somatic afferents, okay? Now, somatic afferents, let's write this down quickly. So, we have visceral afferents and we have somatic afferents, okay? Now, somatic afferents innervate the skin, they innervate muscle, and they innervate the joints, right? As well as the parietal peritoneum, okay? So, visceral afferents, they innervate the organs within the abdomen. So, because visceral afferents are not as densely innervated as somatic, right? There is a very difference in the sort of pain that we experience. So if you imagine whenever think back to when you've had a stomach ache, right? It's a very dull, diffuse sort of pain, and it can go around the whole abdomen, okay? Even though it is a pain in the stomach itself. Now compare that to whenever you've been pricked with a needle or any sort of sharp object on the skin, okay? It's a very different sort of pain. It's very, very localized, sharp pain when it is a somatic afferent carrying that stimulus. So once we've understood this, we can then begin to understand why and begin to answer why the pain starts as a generalized pain, then moves to a localized pain. It is because the generalized pain is from the visceral afferents of the appendix itself, and over time, as appendicitis continues, it then irritates and then can eventually inflame also the peritoneum, okay? And like we've mentioned, the parietal peritoneum is innervated by somatic afferents, and somatic afferents are very localized, okay? They produce a pain that's very localized and sharp in nature, and that pain obviously they experience at McBurney's point, which is 1/3 of the way from the anterior acis to the umbilicus, like we've mentioned, okay? So that's the very sort of typical pain that presents in appendicitis. So it's very, very important that we understand that. Now, the other thing that we can look at is nausea and vomiting, okay? Now, why do nausea and vomiting actually occur? So one other thing that we need to understand here is that the somatic pain pathway and the vagal nuclei are very closely connected. So what does this actually mean? So the somatic pain pathway, or I should say visceral, excuse me. So the visceral pain pathway and the vagal nuclei. So what this means is that when there is the pain actually occurring in appendicitis, the visceral afferents will carry that stimulation, that pain into the brain, right? Now this innervation, right, can actually stimulate the vagus nerve, okay? Now this pathway, like we mentioned, the pain pathways and the vagal nerve, right, they are very closely linked. The exact physiology of that we don't need to understand, but as a general rule of thumb, we'll take that as it is. So because this happens when the vagal nerve is actually activated, what does it do? So we have vagal nerve activation, right? It then goes into the brain and can activate the CTZ, which is the chemoreceptor trigger zone, okay? Now, when this occurs, this is within the brain, right? Within the brain. Now, when the chemoreceptor trigger zone is actually stimulated, it can then go on to trigger the vomiting reflex, the vomiting center within the brain, right? So now it all starts with the original pain signal, then that travels up and activates the vomiting center, which is why you have that feeling of nausea and the desire for the feeling of nausea and vomiting, right? Now, another thing that we need to understand is fever. So patients who have appendicitis can typically present with a low-grade fever. The reason for this is just because of the inflammatory response, right? Inflammation. That's a terrible handwriting, but you get the point. So it's in the inflammatory response. What happens is, because the body releases inflammatory mediators and cytokines, these can then go into the brain, and it can act on the hypothalamus, right? And that the hypothalamus can then in turn increase the body temperature as a direct response to the infection, to protect the body, right? So that's fever. Now, another one we need to understand is anorexia. So anorexia here just meaning loss of appetite is actually very uncommon and unusual for a patient who has appendicitis to have any sort of appetite for food. So the reason for this again is because of the inflammatory response. The inflammation can again trigger different inflammatory mediators that can act on the gut and the brain, which in response as a reflex, not as a reflex, as a protective mechanism, I should say, prevents the desire for eating and satiation. So the gut doesn't become more inflamed than it already is. Okay. Now the next thing that we can mention is Rovsing's sign. Okay, now what is Rovsing's sign? Rovsing's sign, actually let's mention all three: percussion tenderness, as well as rebound tenderness. Okay, now the reason why I'm mentioning all these at once is because they kind of all relate to the same pathophysiology. So these all relate to the irritation and the inflammation of the peritoneum itself. Okay, now when the peritoneum is actually irritated, like we mentioned, because it is innervated by somatic afferents, they're very densely innervated, right? So very localized sort of pain that it would receive. Okay. So Rovsing's sign is when we palpate the left lower quadrant, right, of the patient, it would stimulate the pain in the right lower quadrant where the appendix actually is. The reason for this is because of the movement of the peritoneum, and pushing down on the left lower quadrant can actually stimulate the pain on the right lower quadrant. And same sort of picture with the percussion tenderness and the rebound tenderness. These can all both indicate a peritonitis sort of picture, which can mean potentially that the appendix has actually perforated, so there is full-blown, inflammation of the parietal peritoneum. So these are all things that can present in appendicitis. They're all worth keeping in mind for your exams. So thank you all so much for watching. This was the clinical presentation of appendicitis. In the next video, we'll have a look at the different investigation procedures that we can do. And in the final video, we'll have a look at the management options as well for patients who present with appendicitis. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.